This lesson, which will introduce you to the concept of transnational terrorism. In this lesson, we will be discussing the definition of terrorism, taking a look at the historical context of 4 waves of terror, and looking specifically at some of the causes and effect of transnational terrorism. Starting with defining the term terrorism. The word terrorism is used quite frequently to describe certain acts, usually of violence or the threat of violence. Yet there is still so much debate about defining terrorism, and more specifically when you can label an organization or movement as terrorist. So how do we define terrorism and label an act as such? When an organization is labeled as terrorist, it is perceived as using non-legitimate means of violence, meaning that the use of violence by terrorists is deemed criminal and therefore not acceptable. Typically, we see non-state organizations that use violence will call themselves revolutionary, not terrorists. But the states that they are using violence against will label those organizations as terrorist because of the connotations that the term brings with it. For our purposes, we will simply try to define terrorism as violence perpetrated by a non-state actor that is trying to change government policy or institutions and or influence social behavior. So this is what differentiates terrorism from random acts of criminal violence, that there is a goal aimed at social and or political change. Now, looking at terrorism from a historical perspective, most terrorists are driven by the desire for revolution. That revolution and the reasons behind it will look different depending on the specific historical and cultural context of the time and place that the organization or individuals are acting in. Many of these revolutionary terrorists were separatists who were trying to gain the power for sovereign rule, often for political, ideological, or religious reasons. The goal has often been radical social reorganization, sometimes aimed at destroying old institutions, but at the very least aimed at creating a new social or political order. David Rappaport has described ancient terrorism going back as far as the 1st century. There were the Hindu thugs, the Jewish zealots, Islamic assassins, and even more recent examples of national terrorism, such as the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. What makes the more recent waves of terrorism different is that new technologies have made it possible for revolutionary ideas to spread as waves beyond their original organization, hereby having a wider impact. So when we talk about the waves of terror, we are looking at 4 different waves that have spread throughout different periods of history. The first wave of terror is said to have started around the 1880s. And this was possible in this time because new ideas were spreading more quickly than ever before, thanks to the railroads and the increasing availability of printed publications. This first wave, however, found it no longer sufficient just to spread new ideas of anarchy through newspapers and pamphlets, but felt that more violent means were needed in order to get the public's attention. These anarchists believed that acts of terror would create such social disruption and damage to whichever current regime's legitimacy they were aiming at, that the acts of terror would result in a necessary dismantling of existing institutions. The 1920s saw the birth of the so-called anti-colonial wave of terrorism. After the First World War, anti-colonialists saw opportunities to gain freedom from colonial powers that had been weakened by the war. This second wave of terror often targeted the monopoly on force that the colonial powers had. So they would target military and police powers in order to reduce effective colonial control. This is also the period when the IRA emerged, which is actually one of the few organizations that has continued to survive through these different waves of history of terrorist organizations. This second anti-colonial wave ended around the 1960s. The third wave, also known as the New Left wave, started in the 1960s and ended, for the most part, around the 1990s. This movement was shaped by the Cold War and the successes of guerrilla warfare, like the Viet Cong. We also see in this period how fluid the definition of terrorism can be, because in the New Left period, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was considered a terrorist organization. But nowadays, it is widely viewed as a legitimate revolutionary movement that had been fighting for sovereignty. The 1970s also saw an increase in so-called international terrorist strategies, such as airplane hijacking and strikes against embassies. Finally, we have the fourth religious wave, which started later in the 1970s and actually overlapped partially with the New Left wave. The religious wave has continued on into the 21st century, and many of the religious movements have actually overlapped with ethnic claims to sovereignty that drove the actions of these organizations. Attacks in this wave tended to increase in scale and scope. Terrorist organizations were not only attacking colonial and state powers, but global hegemons and ideals in order to fight for their own religious and cultural identities. Now, while the context, time, and place have shaped terrorist activities and organizations, we still try to develop theories to explain what motivates someone wherever to engage in terrorist activities. And the radicalization theory attempts to explain everything that happens to a person before they actually commit an act of terror. Of course, as is always the case when studying human behavior, this is a combination of factors, making it complicated to discern what actually leads one person to pull the trigger or detonate the bomb. So the difficulty, of course, is that this process is so different for each individual, dependent on the great variety of personal and contextual factors. And for this reason, it is very hard to actually predict who will or will not radicalize. It's impossible to have one list of factors that will say, okay, that will automatically lead someone to commit a terrorist act. They have not been able to do it yet. However, research has found that people are more likely to develop radical ideas when others within their social network also have such views. So social network analysis is often used in order to try and figure out which people may be more likely to radicalize and eventually engage in terrorist activities. But the application of these findings becomes increasingly complex in our modern globalized world, which also brings us into the realm of transnational terrorism. Globalization has given rise to many opportunities for people around the globe. These opportunities can often result in many positive developments, But of course, they also provide similar opportunities for those with less positive intentions. So they provide opportunities for transnational crime, including terrorism. Globalization allows terrorist organizations to operate in a variety of different ways by providing them with new methods and resources. For example, access to the internet provides these terrorists with the means to communicate with other terrorists around the globe, enabling them to organize a network on a global scale. At the same time, globalization also enables these groups to share their message and reasons with more people around the world, hereby increasing the scope of their organizational influence. So-called lone wolves have often radicalized locally under the online influence from terrorists in other countries. And finally, the motivations for terrorism have also changed, as many groups are no longer fighting for freedom or sovereignty within the borders of a given country, but are sometimes fighting against the very values of our modern globalized world. Now, with different causes to transnational terrorism, we also see different effects and ramifications that result from these developments of globalized transnational terrorism. The transnational terrorism trend creates actually quite a conundrum for our system of sovereign states that has dominated international relations since the Treaty of Westphalia. States are now experiencing security threats from organizations outside of their borders, which is problematic since terrorists do not fall within the traditional framework for criminal proceedings and prosecuting. Moreover, transnational terrorist organizations are non-state actors, which means that they are in a gray area in the rules of warfare as defined by the Geneva Conventions. And therefore, it can be more difficult for states to combat transnational terrorism within the conventional legal framework. In conclusion, transnational terrorism and the efforts to combat these organizations affect global and international relations.